first governor that allowed refugee in Iowa, and he specifically answered the call from the United States, like which state wants to take a refugee family, and Iowa, volunteer first because other states didn't want to do it.
After the fall of Saigon in 1975, Ray convinced his friend, President Gerald Ford, to let Iowa accept all 3,500 Thai Dam refugees so that they could keep their families and culture intact.
So he brought the Thai Dam to Iowa as a group, and there are more Thai Dam in the state of Iowa than anywhere outside of Asia, which is an amazing legacy. And also, he has more influence over Indo-Chinese refugee policy than any other governor in history.
I think Iowa gets this gift in being able to show other places in the world that we are predominantly white here, but we're gonna have open arms for our refugees, and we're gonna love them, and we're gonna help them be successful.
Ray welcomed another major wave of refugees at the end of the 1970s, inspired both by news reports and what he witnessed in his own travels to Southeast Asia.
He also says, in 1979, I want to bring in 1,500 additional refugees. So he helps the plight of this group called the Boat People. They were fleeing Vietnam persecution as communism is gaining a firmer hold in the late 1970s.
A CBS News report in January 1979 about the Boat People triggered Ray's decision to act.
And the governor, I remember him saying this. He said, well, we have two choices. We can turn our backs, or we can somehow reach out a hand to help these people who are desperately looking for a place where they can live. Now, no one in the world would have expected the governor of Iowa to do anything about this problem.
In summer 1979, Ray and Quinn accompanied Vice President Walter Mondale to a United Nations meeting in Switzerland where Iowa became a prime example of the U.S. relief effort.
And Vice President Mondale goes up and announces that the United States is going to take 168,000 refugees a year, beginning right then. And it was this incredible moment because all of the delegations, except for the Soviet bloc, the communist bloc, spontaneously stand up and give a standing ovation to this announcement. What an incredible moment of America's humanitarian leadership being recognized. All started by Governor Bob Ray on this cold night in January of 1979 when he saw people suffering, people who didn't look like him, whom he never knew, and to whom many people would say, you don't have any obligation.
We know one of those boat people, don't we? Bob Tran, one of our own. And I tell you, this video was, I think was probably produced about the time that Bob Ray died as a kind of a tribute to him. But I'll also tell you this, that standing behind Robert Ray when he did these things in the mid-'70s, late '70s, early '80s, was hundreds of thousands, millions of Iowans, and he knew that he could count on them because he came from us, right? He was born in Iowa, he was raised in Iowa, he went to school in Iowa, he served in Iowa, both as a leader in the Republican Party, but also as our governor. And he drank the water with us. He knew that water was a water of care and a water of compassion. He knew the people that he led, and he knew that he could count on them. And we all came through. And as a result, Bob Ray then goes on an international stage And not to gain fame or fortune or or glory or say, look at me, or any of those kinds of things. He did this simply because there was a need, that there were people who were in trouble, that there were people whose lives were in danger, so much so that they had to run from their homes in order to simply continue to breathe. And that's what he did. That's what we did. By the way, good morning, everyone. I kind of got started a little early, didn't I? But this is a passion of mine. I remember, and those of you who are watching online, good morning to you as well. We're glad you're all here. I remember I was in seminary and I was on internship in Jewell, Iowa. And we lived in this kind of house apartment building, this big thing that no longer exists, thank goodness. But we had an apartment, and right next door was a much smaller apartment, and that was where the boat people, the refugees, were living. A whole family in this little apartment that couldn't have been more than like 15 feet wide, and it ran the extent of the building, and then there was a basement downstairs. And I remember, of course, they would bring in bags of rice, and you could their cooking, which smelled amazing, would waft over to our apartment. But I remember one day, the furniture truck pulls up, and they start unloading all this furniture. And so I went out and talked to the gentleman who lived there, and he said, "Yeah, we buy on time." They were learning the American way, weren't they? Anyway, Robert Ray, he was born here, he lived here, he died here, and he learned this compassion from all of us. And then he led us, and we stood behind him. And it made so much difference. We became a light in the darkness. Take a look at this up here. Teach me your way, O Lord, that I may walk in your truth. And we became that light in the darkness for literally hundreds of thousands of refugees, people who could have lost their lives very easily. And for that we give God thanks and praise. So I'm going to take a little detour now. We're going to sing first, and I'm going to take a little detour. I think maybe getting into the scriptures would be okay, but we will come back to this in a bit. So for right now, let's just sing. He gave his only Son, that whoever believes on him will not perish, but will have eternal life. Probably the most famous verse in all the Bible. Everyone knows it. You know, you go to football games still, you see John 3:16 hanging up there. And it's so famous and so well known that sometimes you don't hear the bookends, what's before and afterwards. And as you might expect, there's 1,000 different ways to go when you're talking about a verse like this. I could spend at least a month of Sundays just talking about 3:16. But for today, what I'd like to do is just set it in context a little bit, okay? So Jesus is having a conversation with Nicodemus. Nicodemus is a Pharisee, and he's a teacher of the law, and he's well respected. He lives a life of privilege because he has risen to heights in the Jewish community. But Nicodemus is different than most of the others. Most of the others who are part of his ilk, they would just as soon Jesus go away. They don't want to have anything to do with him. He consorts with all the wrong kinds of people, and he's doing these miracles, but they're calling everything into question because, frankly, they just want to undermine him. But Nicodemus isn't like that. He comes to Jesus in the dark of night, probably so he isn't seen, and maybe so Jesus isn't seen as well. They get together in the dark of night, and they have this conversation. And in the course of this conversation, Jesus reminds Nicodemus of an Old Testament story that happened like 1,400 years before this time. This was something I talked about on Wednesday, so I'm going to review just a little bit, but then we're going to pick it up from there. So the story is this. Moses and God's people are in the wilderness, and God's people have been complaining like crazy. First, they don't like the food, so much so that they just as soon go back to Egypt where they were in slavery because they got 3 squares a day. And then there's no water, and they're going to die of thirst. So why not just go back into slavery? And this is a running theme. They complain and they complain and they complain, and then finally this last complaint is there's a direct route to where they're going, but instead God directs them around the direct route. Why? Because it's the land of Edom. It's the land that God promised to Esau way back when. And so God isn't going to break that promise. And so he skirts them around, and they start complaining like crazy. Well, here come the fiery serpents. God puts the fiery serpents there, and they start biting people. And the bites are venomous, and people start dying. And I know what you're thinking. Why did God put serpents there? Why does he punish this? All that sort of thing. That's another sermon for another time, and it's a good question, but let's go there another time. For right now, they're there. And God's people they go to Moses and they say, please, Moses, pray to God to remove the serpents. And so Moses goes to God. And you know something I want you to notice. God does not remove the serpents, and he does not stop the serpents from biting. Instead, he tells Moses, make a snake of bronze, a copper snake, and put it up on a pole. And everybody who looks at that snake, when they're bitten, when they look at that snake, they will not die. Okay? So why doesn't God just remove the snakes? Why does he go through all this rigmarole? Well, it's quite simply this. He's going to remove the snakes just to have other kinds of snakes enter into their lives. I mean, he removes one problem, but here comes the other problem. That's the world through sin that we've created, right? And so he's not just going to take care of that. He's going to take care of the whole business. The people are going to live with the snakes. They're going to be there. The fiery serpents are going to be there. They're going to continue to bite. But in the midst of that, when they look upon God's salvation, the serpent on the pole, isn't that interesting? The instrument of their death is the instrument of their salvation. That's pretty cool too. We'll talk about that one a little bit later as well. The instrument of their death is their instrument of their salvation, and when they look upon the snake on the pole, raised up on the pole, they will live. Now, here's the thing. Could God have removed the snakes? Sure, he could have. But there'd be other snakes, right? And so instead of lifting us up over the top, or God going over the top of us, and then lifting us up over this one problem just to have another problem, he enters into our world. He enters into the dark places. He's there with them, amongst the fiery serpents that would kill them. And he is there, and he offers grace and mercy and life. Right there where you have to live. Now, isn't that much more profound? A much deeper salvation than picking us up and moving us over here, or taking the snakes and throwing them away just to have more snakes come, just to have other kinds of evil befall us? Of course it is. And that's what God does. And so Jesus tells this story, right? And then he then turns to Nicodemus, and he says, Nicodemus, I am the serpent that will be on that pole. I will be raised up. You see, Jesus, God's Son, comes into the world not to do a high pass over the world, not to save only those who are above the fray. And by the way, who are those people? I would like, anybody here? Raise your hand, please. Okay. Yeah, not many are raising their hands, right? Instead, Jesus comes into our world, into the darkness that we know and experience, into the sin that we have created and the evil that is so much a part of our world and our lives. He comes there, and not just to be in it with us, but to experience it himself, to take it upon himself, to subject himself, God's only Son, to subject himself to the same kind of venom that is so much a part of our lives. So much so that he becomes the object of hatred and the most scorned on the earth. And we take him and we put him on trial. It's a kangaroo court. He's done nothing wrong. And we convict him and we nail him to the tree. And there's the serpent lifted up. And the very instrument of our own death, our sin, our evil, our hatred is hanging up there. And that becomes the way of salvation. Okay, read it with me. Would you please, the scripture slide, please, Shelley? Read it with me. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish, but have eternal life. For God sent the Son into the world, not to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him. Leave that up, please, probably for the rest of the section. And so, here's the thing. Okay, so when we think about light, and by the way, right after this comes, Jesus talks about the light. And he talks about light and darkness and following the light. But what Jesus does on the cross looks to us like darkness, because it's sin and evil at its worst. It's what we have done to him, right? But that's the thing. It's almost like a photographic negative. What's dark on an image that we see, a print, is bright white on the negative. And what's bright white on the print is dark on the negative. It's exactly the opposite of what we see and experience. And that's what's happened here. Jesus doesn't come to the light that the world recognizes. He comes to the light that we can't see, because it is mired in all the trials and troubles and problems of this world, the hatreds, the anger, the animosities, the whole business. And I tell you, there's 4 sermons on that as well, because that's where we are right now. So it's where we are a lot of the times, but especially right now in our country. And we will be talking about that soon. And Jesus comes there. And Jesus says, where you see light, where you see darkness, I am the light. And where you experience weakness, I am your strength. And where you are incapable of managing the things in your life, I am the one who makes all things new. And the sin that you so want to hide in shame from others is the place where I come most deeply and profoundly to you. Now, one more thing. Let's go back to this. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. I want you to focus on the word, the term, the world. Okay? Because I think that Nicodemus' understanding of that and Jesus' understanding of that might be two different things. Okay? Nicodemus is, as I said earlier, a Pharisee, right? And he is a teacher of the law. And he's lived a life of privilege. And he's insulated from all the problems of the world because he is in this high place in his society. He's religiously clean in every way. And that means that all of the other things that are out there that are so unseemly are they're divorced from him. They're distant from him, right? But when Jesus says, "For God so loved the world," guess where he's going? Into the darkness that Nicodemus keeps at a distance. And he doesn't just do this with Nicodemus. He does it with his own disciples. So after this, Jesus talks about evil hating the light, and we should follow the darkness, or we should follow the light. We're called to do that. His light is the world's darkness. But his light is something that he's going to begin to show the disciples right away. Next chapter, they go to Samaria. If you know anything about Samaria, it's not a place the Jews want to go, because they are hated rivals. They hate each other. So he goes there. And then he goes to a woman in a town called Sychar who is at the well in the middle of the day because she is not welcomed by the other women who go in the morning, in the cool of the morning. And Jesus takes the disciples there. And he says, "There, that's the light. I'm the light up there. That's the light of me shining in a dark and troubled world. You go there." Okay, let's stop and we'll sing. Okay, let's go back to the refugees in the 1970s. And we rose to the occasion because we were a caring people. And by the way, I'll also tell you something else about Bob Ray. Not only was he a wise and faithful leader, but he was also a Christian. And in the midst of all of this, he went to Missouri to give a speech. Have any of you heard about this? It's so cool. Missouri is, what is Missouri as a state? It is the show me state, right? And so Bob Ray goes to Missouri, right in the heart of show me land, and Bob Ray said, you say you're a caring Christian, show me. And he had this litany. He said, you say that you care about others who are far away. Show me. And on he went. He laid down the gauntlet of challenge. I don't know how it went in Missouri, but isn't that something? To be that passionate about something that's so far away from him that he really shouldn't care about it. But he does. And he found that we do as well. So I thought about all of that as I thought about it. And by the way, there's the white bucket. It's white and not green because Baumgars doesn't make a green bucket. and I like to shop local if possible. But anyway, be that as it may, we have a similar situation right now. It started in, January, February? I think it was February it started, in a place called Ukraine, when the Russian armies came in and decimated the Ukraine, believing that it is theirs, when in fact it was a sovereign state and republic by itself. And you know the story. You saw all the pictures of the refugees, literally millions of them, okay? And it was all over the news, right? And at the time, I know I had more than one person come up to me and say, Pastor Dave, aren't we going to do something about this? And, I knew we had the meal packing event coming up down the pike, and I thought it was going to go to the Caribbean. And my knee-jerk reaction was to move it forward. But then I got to thinking, and maybe, I don't know, maybe this was God talking, because it kind of turned out the way it did. I said, I think we're best off leaving it in November, because if I know the American people, they're going to forget about the refugees. And guess what? We did. I went online this week to try to find some kind of update on the refugee situation. YouTube had one, maybe two videos that were not more than 2 months old, okay? So that tells us, well, obviously the problem doesn't exist anymore. Think again, folks. It exists and it's real, and it's just as pressing now as it was back then. And I'm so thrilled and thankful that the Ukrainians are starting to move the Russians out. But my goodness, there are still millions of displaced people, many of them in Poland. Right? And so this is perfect timing. Because while the rest of the world sort of looks off to the next thing, and they saw the light in darkness at one time, but now they're looking at different lights, we're here, and we're going to do our part to try to sustain folks who have been forgotten. We're looking in the dark place, as Jesus has called us to do. And we are going to be helping people that everyone else has left behind. So we'll be working again with Meals of Hope. And by the way, I don't know if you know this or not, but there's a partner organization called Convoy of Hope. Now, when we packed the meals and left them there, the next day, Convoy of Hope came and picked them all up and delivered them to Haiti. Okay? There were what? Was it 10,000 meals? Is that what we did? Do you remember, Janine? I think it was 10,000 meals, if I'm remembering correctly. We did 10,000 meals, all went down to Haiti, and Convoy of Hope took them down there. And we're going to be hearing more about them as well, because they're an amazing organization. They didn't charge us a dime. They just did it. Okay? They're doing the same thing in Poland. And what happens with the food that we will be packing, it will go to the far eastern part of Poland, and it's going to be distributed to refugees in Poland and taken across the border to folks who have lost their homes, or folks who have been displaced, or folks, and I don't know if you know this or not as well, but many of the refugees are women and children. Why? The men had to stay behind and fight. And some of them have never had fighting experience, and their families are worried sick about them. Okay? By the way, I talked to Convoy of Hope this week, and obviously this is our first job, but they also told us that if we want to put together a pallet of like medical supplies or health kits, they'll take that pallet as well. So that may be something we want to talk about. But for right now, we need to be doing this because of Jesus. And I believe that that's the newest light that Jesus has placed upon us. The light that's gone into the shadows with the rest of the world. And we're being called to this because Jesus saved us from our darkness. He came to our place of shame and sin, that place that we want in the shadows because we want no one to see. And he loved us so much that he became that darkness for us, that he subjected himself to all the evil that the world could muster. And and he died for it. And that is our light. And so we are called to be that same light to others in their dark place. And for that we give God thanks and praise. Amen.